Hello everyone and welcome to today's session, How Effective Quality Assurance Can Enhance Your Application Development Strategy. Thank you for taking time in your busy schedule to join us today. My name is Jose Caso. I am Lanza's Product Marketing Manager. Please feel free to do questions in the Q&A option in the bottom of your screen. We will have a brief moment to answer the questions after the webinar has finished. Yvonne Enselman is the Director of Professional Services at iTech Solutions and is based in Chicago, Illinois. With 25 years of experience in the IBMI industry, starting in the application development, transitioning through quality assurance, and into management. Her passion has been the IBMI and its advancement in the world of business computing. Andrew has over 35 years of business systems design and development experience on various operating system platforms, including 25 years on IBMI S38 and IBMI platforms, plus 30 years with Lanza products, along with team facilitation and software sales. During this time, he has worked with hundreds of companies over the US, Canada, and the Caribbean to help them discover their abilities to deliver advanced forward thinking and effective business systems. Okay, without further introduction. So over to you, Yvonne.
Hi, thank you guys so much for having me involved. I am very excited to be talking about my favorite topic of quality assurance, software testing, modernization, and updating, along with a really great team of people. So we're going to talk about a lot of different concepts today that all have to do with, we're all IT professionals, we want to make things as efficient as possible. We want to work smarter, not harder. And we want to make sure that we're doing that with the best tools in our arsenal. So at the very beginning, I'm going to talk about just some basic techniques that help us make sure everything in our system is being tested the way it needs to be. And then we will move on from there, how we can continually improve how we handle things. So I'm going to start out with a little bit of absolute, QA 101, which is the fact that we need to make sure that we're having statement testing and coverage and decision testing and coverage. It is very important to make sure, especially on systems that are running legacy code, that we are doing tests that make sure we are executing all of the code that can be run on our system on a regular basis. We need to be paying attention even to functionality that we have disengaged or put a little bit off to the side or the back burner. The reason that this is so important is because particularly in older systems that are maybe running old legacy ERP or something like that, you can actually have places where nefarious or malicious code can be inserted and executed simply because it's part of a subroutine or some sort of a module that we don't know is running. So when I was first starting to interact with you guys and check out your product suite, I noticed that you were talking about really having a low code option and things like that, and ways to develop without having some of that extraneous lines out on the system. So Andrew, could you tell me a little bit more about that? Because I really find it fascinating.
Well, thanks, by the way, for coming along and speaking today, or at least speaking with me today. Yeah, so Lanza low code, basically it is, as we'll say to a lot of different people, it is a hybrid low code solution. So yes, there are a lot of typical low code features within the tool, but really to make it most integratable or most flexible, it also has that ability to use a language, to use the language to sort of fine tune all the different things that you're trying to accomplish within the code. So you never have to go and work with, say, the Javas or the Cs or the JavaScripts or the C sharps and all that kind of thing, right? So you're working at a higher level. You're testing at a higher level also. So it's not like just a code generator that creates C code or C# or something like that, it does create all that kind of stuff and it compiles it all. But you're developing, you're maintaining, and you're debugging at that higher level language, right? So so it makes for well, I'm not going to tell you how the QA and testing and all that kind of stuff would work, because you're really the expert there, and that's kind of like why we're having this conversation here today. But in my experience, which unfortunately everybody now knows that I'm not 27 years old, so it just makes testing and development a lot easier, because the code is cleaner, because there's a lot less code, and because you can test at that level, there's a lot less code to fix, to debug, and to change later on. So I'm not sure, is that kind of what you were asking there?
That is totally what I'm asking. It
Okay.
reminds me
Yeah.
of, you know how you feel when you clean out your closet and all of a sudden everything fits in it perfectly. It's just what the feeling I kind of keep getting about this. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more
That's
about
a good picture.
fundamentals.
Sorry,
It
that
is
is a good picture, by the way. I can really
here.
see that now. I'm gonna have to use
Yeah.
that. So go on.
I'm
Oh,
glad that
sorry.
makes me feel good.
Coffee
No,
break.
no. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the fundamentals of quality assurance, because no matter what product you're using, no matter what technology you're using, no matter if you're agile or legacy or waterfall or all of these different words that we can bandy about all day, we really need to make sure that we are all working from the same definitions. When we approach quality assurance, it's not just software testing. It's not just a reactive. Quality assurance and is not just a reactive activity. It's a proactive activity. So we want to get out of the mindset. And I know I've been on the IBMI since I could call it the AS400, because it was really the AS400 when I started.
So you're 27 years old too, are you?
Oh yeah, exactly. I'm
Okay.
going to have my 30th birthday for the. We're not going to mention how many.
We're not going to mention. No.
Okay. All right. So what we know now, right, is that when a lot of us started in development, you write your code, you test it, right? Testing was the end thing. And what we now need to think about, if we're going to think about proper quality assurance, we want to think about front loading how we think about testing before we write things. We want it to become more of an interactive or more of an iterative process. So let's talk about requirements engineering. One of the first things I always say, and I use this analogy like crazy, is you would never run a race if you didn't know where the starting line was and where the finish line was. I mean, how would you feel if you're like, all right, I am going to run a marathon and I'm so excited, and you get halfway through the marathon and you find out that you thought mile 0 was the starting line and somebody else thought it was mile 5. That's not a good feeling. Worse yet, even worse than that would be if we get to like mile 25 and you find out it's really a 30-mile race. That would be terrible. So we want to make sure we're deciding where's our start line, where's our end line. So when we talk about requirements engineering, and whether you're doing agile or traditional or legacy or maintenance testing, or development, any of these things, we want to talk about what are our requirements? Where are we starting? So we're going to do things like we're going to polish the user stories and epics. What do we want to accomplish with this development, right? Then we're going to add in context. Is there anything we need to take into consideration for security? Is there anything we need to integrate with for another system or application platform within our own organization? Is there any third party we need to make sure that we are communicating with? Things like that. Is there a time of year that this is going to have a much higher load tolerance or need for load tolerance than another time of year? And then we start talking about our impacts and dependencies, because all of this, once we put it into the context of the real world, right? Because it's all great and wonderful to talk about application development, but at the end of the day, we're running businesses, right? So what are the impacts and dependencies? How are we going to make sure that all of those things are taken into consideration? Remember, the I in IBMI stands for integration, which means that it is not going to be, just running by itself in the corner, not talking to anything. Usually at this point, we're going to figure out that there's gaps, right? Because we're always, here's what we thought. Oh, wait, we forgot this, that, and the next thing. So let's identify those gaps and fill them in. And then let's talk about the non-functional requirements. So functionality, when we talk about QA, is how well the system does what it needs to do to process the transactions that run my business. Non-functional requirements are how the system, machine, hardware, and OS allow those applications to run. So usually at this point in the game, we're going to figure out, oh, maybe we need more memory. Oh, you know what? That's probably going to have a higher disk requirement at the end of the year because we're going to need to run audits. It's those types of things that we want to make sure we're taking into consideration ahead of time, because it's a whole lot easier to add disk when you're not stressed out than it is when you are.
You know, seasonality, as you were mentioning earlier, that's an interesting one. It's something that I guess, especially in something like catalog type applications, like our Commerce Edition, our Commerce Edition package, for example. That's a place where, yeah, seasonality makes a difference, because around Christmas time or Thanksgiving or something like that, you're going to have, you know, 10, 20, maybe 100 times, 1,000 times more business right at that time. You know, that kind of load on your AS400 than any other time in in your system. And you can't just say that, oh, you know what, that's only 1% of the year. Like, oh, big deal, you know, we can handle that. You probably can't, right? Because when your business is dependent on those seasonal sort of periods, and you can't handle it at those times specifically, yeah, that's going to really affect you. So yeah, I guess thinking ahead is really is really going to impact the way you the way you lay out your systems and your application design too. And
Exactly. And what you want to avoid is always making sure that you are, it's so frequent that we will get into a high stress environment and then realize that we've made a problem in configuration or expectation. So now when it's already our busy season and we're already stressed out, or another example that I've seen a lot is during audit time. Now we need to reload a bunch of information onto the system because the auditors need it, and we're going to run analysis on that data. So we're doing our normal business, plus we're loading stuff that's been offloaded for storage. Okay, now we can't work, and everyone's stressed out because it's a little bit of a perfect storm. So we want to avoid perfect storms. We want to make sure we've got like the best functionality. So one of the ways we can do that is by looking at user stories and ethics. And again, this session is kind of focused on more of the agile or iterative develop methodologies, but that's because a lot of our IBMI systems have an agile or an iterative mindset for new development. And LANSA is so strong in the modernization options that it offers. So that's a little bit where I'm focusing this, although it does actually also translate to legacy and maintenance. So of course, what is a storyboard? What is story mapping? What are all these words I keep hearing? So let's talk about this, because no matter what type of development lifecycle you're in, these 5 issues are important. So storyboards are something a user usually needs to be able to have the system do, right? So let's take an example. If I am working in the warehouse and I've got an RF gun, I need to be able to get my pick ticket to my RF gun. I needed to have it tell me where I need to go. I need to be able to get that product to the shipping dock. That is a storyboard, right? That is one feature of an entire application. Story mapping is when you tie together, okay, not only does that one picker with that one RF gun need to be able to do all of that, but simultaneously, the warehouse manager needs to see what's going on. Simultaneously, the shipping manager needs to know, or the shipping technique table needs to know what's coming out of the stacks. Simultaneously, inventory needs to be being docked. Simultaneously, we need to be generating invoices. Simultaneously, we need to make sure the bill of material is all set for our shipping company. Things like this. So storyboards are this is a job that needs to get done. This is the way this job needs to get done. Story mapping is putting all of those stories that happen simultaneously within our organization into a coherent narrative. The reason I actually like using the word stories and story mapping is because, you know, we what's the first thing we teach kids to do? We teach them how to read, right? And so it's a way our brains work. You know, our businesses and how our businesses run are really a story. And it's a
Mhm.
narrative that gets our organizations to function. Obviously, like every good story, you have characters. And I don't know about you, but I've worked with some real characters in my life. Um, so we have personas. Who's going to be doing this? Who's going to need this? And I'm going to say this upside down and backwards. You're going to get sick of hearing me say it. Personas are incredibly important right now because we're talking more about security in every aspect of IT. And if we're not talking about it, we should be. You need to start defining personas, particularly in the IBMI, but everywhere. Who needs what authority? And use authorization groups, use limited authority, only let groups have the amount of authority they need for a specific job, escalate it only into special user IDs and groups. I cannot tell you how important it is to define this is the most security this position should have. This is the most authority this position. And we've not done that. I mean, you know, talk to anybody in the IBMI world, there's a million jokes about all user. So we know that. Diagrams are when we start pulling that information together and making sure we haven't forgotten anything, right? Okay, we're all good. We've got all of our characters. We've got our warehouse. We've got our customer service. We have got EDI. We have got invoicing. Oops, we totally forgot about shipping. Bad, you know, that's where we want to start putting this together. And then use cases are when we're going to kind of impose this on the actual technology that we're running on. So that's when we start looking at all of those non-functional things I talked about in the last slide. So the use cases are when we say, okay, this is what needs to be the resources on our system. This is what we need in memory. These are all the connections we need to have open. These are the internal ports we're going to be letting this talk to. These are the external ports. This is where we need to make sure it's being vetted through our firewall. This is where we're going to double check security. All of these things are what we want to do at that point.
It sounds like the use cases are kind of the situations that the individuals, which we define through personas, are being subjected to. So there's sort of the, you know, there's the players, and then here are the things that are happening in the world. And what we're trying to come up with is, you know, how do those players react to or deal with that world? Does that sound like a
Exactly.
okay. Something else I
Exactly.
noticed in that was that in my old days, we also did some. It's just funny how terminology changes over time, right? Like low code or 4GL and all those terms, they're all kind of the same, right? And it's just that as time goes by, the name changes. But you know, back in the day, we used to run conference room pilots where we would have the individuals like from different departments, like the sort of lead expert users come into a room, into a conference room, really, and they would play out the parts, right? There's no system in place yet, but they play out the parts, so we would know what those interactions are, so that we could understand. Well, we'd throw the use cases at them, and then they would individually say, well, you know, based on what, you know, we understand or what we do, what we're thinking of designing or how we wanted this thing to work. I do this and this and this and this, and then somebody else says, okay, and then I take over and do this and this and this, and someone else says, well, yeah, and I do this, and there's sort of they've got the script in front of them, and when they see that there's a missing piece, like the warehouse manager says, oh, I never get to find out when something's going to show up at the dock. And that's where you say, oh, okay, yeah, I guess we missed that or something. So we used to call that conference room pilots. So it's interesting. Okay,
You
this
know,
is better.
it's funny that you mentioned that
It names
because
it all out. Go ahead. Sorry.
it is. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It's funny that you mentioned that because one of my absolute favorite planning techniques as a tester is something that is called the Wizard of Oz School of Design. And what it is, and it sounds a little bit silly, is you put all of the stakeholders in a conference room and you say, okay, this is, a fundamental piece of data that comes into our system. Let's do it as high level as possible. In order, you've got a customer number, you've got an item, right? And this comes into our system, and now let's map, without using any computers, just whiteboards, post-it notes, whatever you want. Let's map exactly everything that piece of data needs to do to navigate our system. And the thing about it is, I like it for two reasons. The one thing is, obviously, you can tell it's going to get a lot more detailed. It starts obviously very high level, but it gets everybody goofing around a little bit. It gets us away from our screens. It's a little bit silly. It feels really silly at first. So everyone's a little bit like, hey, we're kind of laughing. And it just gets everybody on the same page. So that's the exact same thing where all of a sudden, by the act of talking it out without a computer, all of a sudden you realize all of these components you hadn't thought of before. And it's just a way for us to get our brains to think differently.
Allow us
Teamwork
to
is
be more
all
creative.
right.
Yeah, allow
And
us to be a little bit more creative.
Exactly. So it's very cool.
Something else that sort of came to mind, as you're going through that last slide was, it just kind of reminded me a little bit about our visual answer frameworks. I think you might have seen that at some point in time, where an analyst can sit down with a group of users and prototype an application. Now, this is more computer oriented, so I guess you've got to have a certain foundation, like the storyboards and some story mappings and stuff like that, and the personas. But there's a point at which you start actually defining what's going to be in a system, what's going to be in this new module you're creating, and the visual answer framework actually allows that person to start prototyping in the presence of these users, in the presence of these personas, I guess you could say. They're describing what they need to do, and in the visual answer framework, the person, the analyst is creating what we'll call business objects. So we're saying, oh, we're working with customers, all right. So now how do we see the customers? And so we identify them, by their name. We know their names, we know their numbers, we know the city that they're in. So at least some user identifiable information. And then, okay, so what do you do with these people? And then they say, well, we do these things with them, right? And so they turn out to be, what we call like command handlers. This is technically what we call them in the visual answer framework. But in these individual command handlers, these things that we do, like we create new customers or we modify these customers. I'm just taking a very simple example here. But in words, we can type out in these places on the screen, we can type out what it is that functionality is and fine tune that functionality, and then hand this over to a programmer overnight or in the afternoon or something. And they can fill in, they can just replace those bits, those command handlers, those little bits of functionality with real working code. And they're small, right? Because we're not dealing with a whole system at the same time. We're dealing just with that little bit of functionality, right? Going back to maintainability and standardization and all those types of things, or moving forward to that. I'm not sure whether we talked about that. No, we haven't talked about that yet. But anyway, but that's kind of, I sort of get the feeling that in something like this, in this conference room pilot, as part of that exercise, or in that analyzing the user stories, as you said, polishing the user stories, and I thought it was Polish user stories, and I thought, well, what about Lithuanian user stories? But that's a whole other thing. But in that exercise, I can just in my head see someone sitting down with a visual answer framework and working with users, polishing those user stories into something that turns into a system. Sorry, I don't think I'm digressing, but I'm just kind of imagining that's somewhere where we're doing this. So okay, cool. Sorry,
No, perfect. And that actually goes to a really important point. And one of, again, one of the things that was attracting me to this webinar and partnership was the fact that there are so many points where I know where we need to start and where we need to finish. And the hardest thing for any manager, right, or whatever part of IT development we're working on, is getting the things that we can quantify in a conference room into actual usable design. And I was looking at some of the stuff on your website. I'm like, that's the way, I always refer to this. I work with a highly technical team, And I always refer to how, they're absolutely brilliant, but eventually it has to be documented in such a way that we're communicating it to our customers. And I keep saying, I really need some sort of a vacuum that I just attach to their foreheads, and it sucks out the words I need. And that kind of reminded me of that, LANSA and that framework structure is that way of like attaching a vacuum to the user's head and pulling out what they need in a way that a developer can actually work with it.
Earlier on, I said there's a term that I liked, and I think I'm going to use that. This is one of the things I'm going to try to forget. Something about putting a vacuum on someone's brain just illustrates bad scenarios. But anyway, okay.
I don't know why my team won't let me do that. They're so mean. They're just, unrealistic.
That's just for some users, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Actually, I think sometimes they would rather I was doing that than, having to actually talk to me, but that's okay. That's a teamwork, kind of like siblings. I don't have to.
They have a lot of work to do. Actually, that really is a point. There is some reality to that because they have a lot of work to do, right? They don't. They're not just sitting around waiting for us to vacuum stuff out of their heads. They've got a lot of stuff to do. They got their normal work to do, and they're thinking in those terms all day long. And then suddenly you come around and say, "Okay, now forget what you do all day and give me some of that time that you obviously don't have. And give me some of that time and think completely differently. Think in the way that you would."
And no one has that time. Particularly right now, IT teams are just, they're stressed to the max. The bandwidth is worse than I've ever seen it. And again, this isn't my first rodeo. So I would say that absolutely anything that lets us automate communication, documentation, and standards within an organization, and that time-saving component is worth its weight in gold. Just because, there's too much work. And we need a way to make it simpler.
And that's where low code, I guess, then really fits in also nowadays, especially because we can get those micro results back to them that much more quickly once we're in the development phase, right? In that iterative development phase, we can get it back to them that much faster for proofing, right? Did we get this right? Is this going to work as part of that user story, or do we have to tweak that again? So, okay.
Exactly. So this slide is actually one of my cheat sheets. I don't know if anyone on this webinar has heard me speak before, but one of my favorite things to do is give cheat sheets because, of course, I'm a QA person in a development world, and people don't think the way I do all the time. And I constantly have developers come up to me after my sessions and say, okay, but how do I get started doing any of that? So I started putting cheat sheets into all of my presentations. So I told you in the last slide, we have to come up with where the start line is. This is how you determine that start line as an organization or as a project manager. You're going to start with the elicitation. What do we need to do? We're going to document it. You're going to have anybody who is a stakeholder in the project write down what they need, right? If you can't write it down, how am I going to have somebody write code to it, right? Then negotiation, validation, you can never have everything. And sometimes things are redundant. Sometimes somebody knows a better way. Sometimes it has to be pushed to another phase. Then management, you take all of this information and you make it into a coherent plan. Then we start with the quantitative questionnaires. That is when we take what we have all agreed is going to be what we want to do, and we make sure it can function on the platform the way it is currently configured. That's that non-functional. Are we making sure the system's going to work okay? And then we do qualitative questionnaires and answers. And what that's going to say is, if you look at everything that we've come up to in this project plan, right? We've agreed that this is the project. Have we hit everything? Are you seeing any problems? Are you comfortable with testing it? And qualitative interviews. Have we made sure, kind of going back to that persona idea, have we made sure everyone is going to be able to do their job after this project is completed? So that's how you start. That's how you come up with the start line. Okay, so the next 3 slides crack me up because the one question I've gotten asked more often than any other recently is, first it started with test-driven development. Now there's behavior-driven development. Now there's acceptance test-driven development. Now there's this other driven development. I don't know what all of these things mean. So I have drilled down to what I think are the best ways to do it. And I have to warn you, I love this comic, and I have to make myself not laugh because I just think it's absolutely perfect. So test-driven development are really a form of unit tests. What it means is, in a nutshell, if I, as a developer, am going to write something or develop something using a tool or whatever it might be, I need to know how the end user is going to let me know I've done it right. So if you give me a request, I need to have clear enough requirements that I know how to test it to make sure I'm giving you what you need. That's all. We just want to make sure that we have enough clarity that when you tell me I need to do XYZ, I can prove I've developed XYZ. Okay, so that's test-driven development. Behavior-driven development is more what is considered to be integration testing, where we say, okay, we know that nothing works in a silo. We know nothing is just one process running at one time in any company. So what we say is all of these user stories, each of those individual things I tested in the previous screen, have to be able to work as one. So behavior-driven development means all of these behaviors are going to be happening on my system simultaneously. Can this happen without things going wrong? So behavior-driven development is synonymous with integration testing in old parlance. And again, it just is making sure, can everybody hit enter at the same time and not crash the system?
Mm-hmm.
Acceptance test-driven development is actually focused on system testing. So this is when we start merging what our users need the system to do with how the system is capable of doing it. So that's when we start looking into security. I just talked about we want to have security locked down. We also don't want to have security locked down so much that no one can do their jobs, right? Or that you have to escalate everything. So by thinking about acceptance testing as a whole, what we're doing is saying, at what point can we put in speed bumps, for lack of a better term, and say, okay, when the car hits here, we want to make sure we can get over it, but we don't want to have to be testing the whole system. So where do we put in our stop signs? So that is what those D keywords that you're probably hearing a lot all mean.
Okay. Yeah. So one thing I'm thinking about here is at this point we're already delivering stuff, right? And I guess looking at the standards that you're delivering, there's writing software, and then there's coming up with the way that you're going to write that software, because there's what it is you got to write. There's the requirements themselves, right? There's the code you're going to create, but even before that, I kind of see how do you then use whatever tool it is you're going to use, whether it's RPG or C or moving off the platform to other languages, or Lancer for that matter, right? Using constructs that that fit in with so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel for every program. How you're going to implement security for that particular, authority for that particular action. How do things look even on a screen? So kind of like the standards of how things work and look would have been predefined already by this point also. So I think that's a whole other piece. I'm not sure I noticed anywhere. That's a whole other piece of design or an application or a project design that I think I see missing here, which is just defining those standards within how your code's going to look and how you integrate things together also. I'm not sure if you've covered that, or if you feel that that's covered somewhere in here, but I know that's something that's pretty important.
I think it's one of the challenges that faces things. And so what I always say is that's when you want to make sure you have as much infrastructure as possible. And that is where I've seen customers and companies go to tools. such as Lanza, because that is where, you know, one of the values of a tool is it says, okay, exactly what you're talking about. We know all of these things have to be done to get something from concept to production. And we're going to give you that structure, and then you fill in what needs to happen in between. And
So
that's
you don't have to come up with
where,
that yourself.
right, exactly.
Right.
And you know, no one would want to write an ERP system from scratch. You know, I've never known anyone who'd be like, okay, we're going to start a brand new bank and we're going to write all of the software. No, obviously not. You go to a package. This is the same thing. By using tools like Lanza, you put everything you know needs to be done into structure, and then the tool itself helps you move the ball down the field to exactly your point, so that you don't have to manually do any of those things anymore. You're filling in the blanks rather than writing the questions.
Yeah. And again, that's where the visual answer framework can come in, it comes in nicely. I mean, we've got other components within Lanza that kind of do the same thing also. But there's also that whole concept of, my pet feature of Lanza, which is wizards and templates, right? So, because they create functional code that does a specific thing in a specific way, so that when you're at, beyond the QA, when you're going back to change things, it doesn't matter who's changing it. You know what it's going to look like, because all the parts of the system that do similar things are going to look the same way, right? And it's proven code, right? It's not like, oh, every component has been programmed from scratch, and the programmers put in a lot of artistry into that, right? Artistry can be, well, just like when you go to the Louvre, you got to try to interpret all these bits of art that's hanging on the wall. We don't want to interpret this stuff. We just want to know that, oh, we know what this does. We know how it does that. We just go in and mechanically change that to fix it, right? And that's where, things like the visual answer framework and wizards and templates within Lanza also, help out. And then there's also, we've got other tools like our I've lost the name already. It's our it's another framework for creating public web applications also. Why does that left my head? I'll come up with it and I'll mention it. I'll just go, hey, I remember now. It's not even Monday morning. But anyway, okay, so
as I keep saying, it's been a really long month this week. But and I think that's when we go into experience-based testing, and you're talking about that piece that's where we bring in experience-based testing, which means we're going to be doing black box testing techniques and creating test charters. And that's where all that kind of comes in. So I think we have hit that one. I'm going to kick us over to our next slide, which is the aspect of code quality. Refactoring is tremendously important. This is how we keep things moving forward. Modernization is tremendously important. So we want to make sure that at any given time that we're doing new development, we're paying attention to technical debt. We also want to make sure that we have projects that address the technical debt that are already on our system. And this is where tools like Lanza come in so tremendously importantly, because there's no way in a modern IBM shop that any project can happen that's going to go through everything that's on the system and make sure that it gets cleaned up. That's completely unrealistic. But when you implement a tool that's going to have the ability to say, okay, we're going to pull out all of this stuff, we're going to clean everything up, and then we're going to figure out exactly what we need to do. So that's just a way for us to think about it. And it's very important as we do new development to think about creating it clean as soon as possible. So that's things like code reviews and static code analysis to make sure that we don't have this monolith of code running on our systems that we have no clue what it's even doing anymore, but it's been on our system for the last 20 years. So that's pretty much where I go with this one.
Just a question on refactoring. Now, I've had, I think I know what it is, but I've had, a number of people thinking that, refactoring was where I take, let's say, RPG and I turn it into something like Lanza. I'm not going to. I don't think that that's what we're talking about here. The refactoring here is to look for that streamlining within the code to make it obvious that what it is that it does, and that it does really nothing else other than what it's supposed to do. Am I on the right track with refactoring?
What refactoring does, you're right, you are definitely on the right track. What refactoring does is it takes code that is currently functional as is, and it reanalyzes and develops that code to be secure, streamlined, modern, and clean. So an example would be, back in the day, I wrote a program that was, I think, like 50,000 lines of RPG code. That program is now still in existence at where I used to work 20 whatever years ago. A good thing for refactoring would be there are now APIs, not to mention RPG has evolved in the last 40 years, 20 years, well, 40 years. But in this particular case, 25 years. RPG has evolved to such a point that what took me 50,000 lines of code back in the late 90s now could be done reasonably well in about 5,000 lines of code.
That's
right?
pretty good.
So what we want to do is we want to rewrite that. We know it's working, and I get the attitude, it's working, why fix it? But what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're limiting that down to that smaller clump of code. And one of the reasons for that is that if you have code that is so monolithic and not all the lines are being run, going back to the first thing I said about statement and decision coverage, you don't know, somebody could put malicious code into there. It's a line in an RPG program, right? Not that hard to put that in there.
Never find it.
And you'd never find it, and who knows what that could be doing. So if you're not paying attention to your system and you have these huge things. So what refactoring says is, you know what, this might not be the best way to do it. Maybe it was the best way to do it 25 years ago. But at this point, we want to do it better.
Okay. So in fact, my customers are sort of half right, and I'm half right, in that, yeah, refactoring could actually be a rewrite of that module, of that component. So when you're doing a rewrite, because it could be a rewrite, right? When you're doing that rewrite, because you know what it's supposed to do, then rewrite it or write it in a way that it does that in a more maintainable way, with a more modern tool, I guess, in that case. So refactoring could be taking that RPG program, that monolithic 50,000 RPG program, and turning that into a 2,000 line Lancer program, maybe. So
exactly.
Right.
Another way of looking at this would be, let's talk about cars. Engines are a perfect example of something that has been refactored. In this day and age, you would never put an engine that was designed for use in a 1970s Impala in a 2022 Prius, right? So why are we doing that with programming code?
That's a good picture. That's a good picture. I get it. Okay.
It's right out there with
Right.
sucking information out of people's brains.
No, it's not. No, it's not. No, it's not. Okay. All right.
All right. So test automation. This is another one that people ask me about all the time. They do have a lot of keywords. So let's talk about the two big ones. Data-driven testing is the idea of saying we want to be able to reuse automated tests. So what we're going to do is say this type of data needs to run through the system this way. We don't care what the actual data itself is. We want to make sure that we've got an automated test case that can run this data through our system. Keyword-driven testing, on the other hand, which is another concept in automation, is a way of saying I am going to figure out what needs to be tested in a human readable way, logical way, and then a tool, an automated testing tool, is going to organize that into testing with me. There are a bunch of test automation approaches, and again, in the IBM I world, there isn't going to be a one size fits all necessarily. And in a lot of cases, you might have one testing methodology for your user experience team, one for your batch programs, one for, you know, security testing and vulnerabilities and things like that. So as we move forward, I get asked about test automation on the eye more often than probably anything else. And we just need to make sure that we're starting to think about how to automate that oversight.
Okay.
I would imagine you
I
get
know
that question a lot.
Well, the difference between data-driven and keyword, though, is not something that I get a lot of. Not me. Our services division, they might get a lot more of that. I've had some experience with or I know we as a company have had a lot of experience with testing tools, automated testing tools, and I know we've got one in. I think we're part of a larger group of companies of products under the Idera brand, and one of those other tools is Ranorex, right, for for automated testing and things like that. So I know that in the 5250 world, yeah, there are some, but one thing that we've done with for at least data-driven testing, for scripting that type of testing also for 5250 applications is, well, as you might know, you might have noticed, we also have the Axes product, which takes a 5250 application and automatically just converts it all into a browser-based application, right? So you don't have to do any work at all. I mean, you can do work if you want to pretty it up and make it look better, maybe change how some of it works, add more functionality into the application, to your 5250 application, and really fool the user into thinking this is not 5250, this is a web application. Well, in fact, it is a web application, but it's still based on the 5250 application, right? On the 400. But the cool thing here is that you can mix up Ranorex with Axes, right? So just have Axes run the application, vanilla, right? You don't have to do any work to it. And then Ranorex tests web applications. So you can actually have Ranorex test, throw test data and test scenarios at Axes, which then runs all of that on, as the 5250 application. So you're actually getting you're getting 5250 automated testing in the way that modern shops do their web testing, right? Which I thought was kind of a neat use case for Ranorex and for Axes. But anyway, I'm going to throw that out there because it's just something that I don't see a lot being done in the 5250 world in that sense, or on the AS400 world. I might be wrong. It's just that I've not been exposed to a lot of companies that have been doing automated, either data-driven or keyword-driven testing on an AS400. So.
Yeah, it's unfortunately, I would love to see more automated testing on the eye. I think that is one area, if anyone's listening to me, that there's a great market niche there. So I know that there are some options for it. I'd like to see more. I'd like to see more integration. But yeah, absolutely what you're talking about. And again, it isn't necessarily a one size fits all. So even the fact that there are products that integrate, I think are super important. All right, so.
I love that picture, by the way.
I do too. I was like, this needs to like be put above my desk because this is my world. Okay, so continuous integration, testing, and deployment. Oh yeah, I was giggling hysterically as I was going through the slide deck. The pictures aren't mine. The content is mine. The pictures are Jose. Give credit where credit.
Just to make sure everyone knows, that's right. Jose put the visuals together. And Yvonne is the person who put all the smarts into the words. So
no, the pictures are way better. So of course I'm giggling hysterically, and my kids are like, "What's so funny?" I'm like, "You got to see these videos, these comics." All right. So the reason we care about all of this and what we want to try and do as we talk about modernization and improvement is we want to do the impact on testing. We want to make sure that there's a role in delivery and deployment. We want to minimize time between writing code or requesting features and having them actually used in production. We want to make sure that we have testing components throughout our development life cycle, so that we're not waiting to the end. Back in the day, it used to be, first you do analysis, and then you do planning, and then you do development, and then you do testing. And then of course you would always run out of time. So testing would be cut short. What we want to do is put smaller amounts of testing in everywhere so that we know that it's being done, and then we don't have to wait for something to break before we fix it. That is just the most important thing. So we want to start making sure that we're looking at things very quickly, that we have automation or tool support at every point where it makes sense to us. And that we can do that thing. The last thing you want to do is say, okay, on Monday, I'm going to say, I want something for dinner. And then I don't go shopping until Friday. And then I don't want to eat that anymore, right? We don't want our users to say, I need to do this. And then they end up putting in a cumbersome workaround because it takes us too long to get it to them. And then by the time we give it to them to be done properly, they've already got this workaround that they're used to, and we're creating technical debt. So things like this, we just want to make sure that we are getting more and more iterative, and we want to focus on when we need something, let's get it into production. So that's really what this is in a nutshell.
I know you and I have talked about this before, and you sort of said a few words on this, but but I've looked at this when I see, especially when I see that picture, right, and I look at words like phrases like immediate feedback, right, and verify the code, test early, often, test everywhere, and just the feedback, not just from the users now, but also the feedback from the developers. There's tools for that also, and some of the newer versions of those tools are tools like newer as in the last decade, say, which in our in our 27, 28 years of life, you and I, that's a long time, right? So, but things like GitHub and GitLab and all those types of tools, which are not just code versioning tools, but they're also they also contribute a lot to this CI/CD, this continuous integration and deployment delivery. They really lend a lot to that too, so that users can as they're testing something, they can log an issue, and then the project manager can say, oh, all right, and they'd analyze that issue, put in notes about that issue, and then assign that issue to a developer. The developer then takes that, does their own analysis, starts changing the code, and attaches all the modifications that they've done in that code to that issue, right? So that at some point in time, we can then merge all this code that maybe multiple developers are working on, right? And so things like GitHub, by the way, GitHub and GitLab and tools like that are useful for, I would say they're useful for any shop that has two or more, programmers on a team, right? And in fact, even if you had only one programmer, it's fun to do and useful in those cases also, but especially useful when you've got a bunch of different users in a bunch of different departments trying to get their feedback to you, and then you as a programmer being able to respond to that, and not just in words, but in code also, that can then be merged and tested in a separate environment, and then backed out or changed again, at will. Right. So I don't know if you've got some thoughts on tools. I know you said you've used the GitHub. I think you've used in the past. How to, and Lance, of course. I wouldn't mention this really if Lance wasn't so strong in that area also. Right. So we integrate with GitHub and GitLab. In fact, our European group they tend to use GitHub a lot. And our North American group services group, they tend to use GitLab a lot. Not just a lot. I think in every project they use that for many of these reasons that I just mentioned. Your thoughts on those types of tools?
I love those types of tools. I think that they're tremendously important because of the collaborative nature of development that is so incredibly important in modern effective IT departments. And what I like about the integration with Lansa is, these tools are great, but they're one piece of a jigsaw puzzle, right? And what you really need is the frame of the puzzle. And again, I haven't used Lansa personally in a long time, but from our conversations, what this reminds me of is, Lansa is the framework that tells you all of the puzzle pieces go within these four walls, right? And tells you what the picture is going to look like. And then we can layer things in with different tools, different development types, different technologies, and different elements of our organizations. So that's one of the things I like about it. Again, anything that keeps people talking to each other and tracking things throughout the DevOps process, I think is tremendously important.
And keeping that knowledge documented, of course.
Exactly. And structured,
Yes.
because you can document the heck out of it, but if you've got 10 different people doing things 10 different ways, you're never going to be able to figure out one thing again. So I always think that it goes back to having a tool that is the structural organization of your development team, and then use the other tools to integrate with it for the specific needs that you have.
Okay. Thank you very much, Yvonne. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but it's a really interesting conversation that perhaps we might be able to do part 2, because I guess there's so many topics to continue talking about this. So let's leave some time to make to answer some questions from the audience. That'll be good.
Sure.
So everyone in the audience, please feel free to do questions in the Q&A option in the bottom of your screen, and we will be happy to answer. We already have some here, so perhaps we should start with those. So the first one, it says, how does experience-based testing fit with organizations willing to modernize their applications?
Okay, so experience-based testing, and there's a little bit of a joke going around in QA circles about experience-based testing is just having a whole bunch of people try to break the system. Not really. Experience-based testing is saying, you know what, we know that this is a crucial mission critical job process, and we know that these are the areas that it can break. So for experience-based testing, we're going to layer in multiple knowledge bases. So you're going to have the end user who could break software no matter, we all have that super user who could break stuff. No matter what, no matter how perfect it is, you give it to that one user, they're going to find the one bug. And that's a good thing. I say that with I say that with respect. You're going to put in somebody who has a lot of knowledge about the database. And then you're going to have somebody who knows the application, and you're going to have them talk about, okay, this is the right way to test this to make sure we're checking on everything. And it does, experience-based testing needs to be a merge of the end users and actually checking the back end, because as we modernize, one of the things that can be a problem is we end up breaking something that we didn't know we broke until a few months from now. And that is, of course, why people don't like to do refactoring. So I always say that experience-based means you bring people in who have the experience to know, and you come up with test cases that kind of span an entire process. And at every given point, you stop and you check. So you're not going to run, the entire month-end process or the entire evening. So even if we're working on that, you're going to say, okay, we're going to run month-end, but we're going to stop it at this program. We're going to stop it at this program. We're going to stop it at this program, and we're going to look. So that's where I say experience comes in.
So there's almost also the same way you could call this expert-based testing.
Right.
Okay. All right. I see where the confusion can come from then.
Yeah, and I'll be the first one to admit QA has got as many terms that will get confused with other things as RPG does.
Yes. Jose, how are we doing on time?
We are a little bit tight, but I guess we have
okay.
We have some time to answer, I guess, another question.
Fire away.
Okay. Do you considering refactoring worth the risk in today's modernization strategy when you have tools that allow to expose the working application for modern use?
I would say refactoring is absolutely worth it. However, I also do recommend using tools for refactoring when that is an option for an organization. I always think that refactoring is a good idea. because again, I've seen so many companies where, things will fail in testing because of a program that really isn't even being used on the system anymore, interacting with a component.
There might be another way to look at this question also, which is, if I've got a piece of working code that's been working there for 25 years in your case, and all I want to do is modernize it. And so instead of breaking it apart and maybe reusing parts of it or refactoring it, to use it as a Windows client server or a browser application, just use something like a Lanza Axes, 5250 5250 modernization tool, to take that 5250 application as you have it, that monolithic application that just has never failed, right? And just present that as a new browser application, and really just dress it up with colors and extra features outside of the working code itself. I wonder if it could be understood that way also. In which case, I'd say that's still a temporary fix, right? It's a good thing, it'll add life to the working applications you already have. But at some point in time, you're still all you're doing is you're delaying the inevitable. At some point in time, you're gonna need to go back and revisit those programs, those monolithic programs, and do a certain amount of refactoring anyway, right? So yeah, it's good to use those other tools to modernize those monolithic applications, partially because you're afraid to touch those applications. But again, somewhere along the line, you're gonna have to bite the bullet at some point in time. I'm not scaring people away from using modernization tools, but more that it is you would do that. I would suggest you do that to give yourself time to accomplish some of the other things that you've got to do, especially these days when we're short-staffed as it is, right? So
Exactly, that's a great way of looking at it. Yeah.
All righty. Okay. Well, I guess this leads to saying goodbye at this moment, but I believe it was a great conversation.
Yvonne, thanks for your time.
Oh, thank you guys for involving me. This was absolutely so much fun.
Yeah, well, thanks for attending to this webinar on how effective quality assurance can enhance your application development strategy. And again, I would like to thank Yvonne Enselman, Director of Professional Services at iTech Solution, and Andrew Baisunas, Senior Engineer at Lanza. We hope this webinar will inspire you to explore possibilities with Lanza. In case you joined late, we'll soon be sharing the recording of this webinar. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact Lanza at info@lanza.com. This concludes today's webinar. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
See y'all.